Thank you. I don't think I am anymore. Am I getting feedback now?
No.
No, okay, good. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, if there is anybody, we're just waiting for a few minutes to get all the electronics correct, and we will be starting the meeting momentarily.
Thank you, Brandon.
Everybody ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's call this meeting to order and confirm that we do have a quorum. And like I said, with Commissioner Lockhart is on Zoom and joining us. This is a Board of County Commissions work session for January 12th, 2021. The work session meeting will be viewed in person in the BCC chambers. Okay. We are now in an echo chamber. Has that been fixed?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. On SGTV and on YouTube, and by registering to participate in the Zoom webinar, residents can provide public comment in person and on, or by registering to speak at the Seminole County website and the Board of County Commissioners webpage. There you will find a link to register for the webinar entitled Meeting Webinar Registration and Helpful Hints. If you are unable to join via computer online, interested parties should call 407-665-0808 for additional information on how to participate via telephone. We will take public comment on each item as it appears on the agenda. In order to be recognized to speak, if you are using a computer or iPad, you will need to use the raise hand feature, or if calling in on a telephone, you will need to press *9. If you attend the meeting in person, and you will be required to wear a mask and social distance. If you do not have a mask, one will be provided for you. Also, please silence all cell and electronic devices. I asked Commissioner Zimbauer to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, so if you will.
Please rise and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Commissioner Zimbauer.
Thank you, Chairman.
Appreciate it. Kevin Fisher and Scott Seck with Horizon Engineering Group will be presenting the Seminole Wekiva Trail pedestrian and bike overpass at 434 and 436. John Dredge, Director of Public Works, is also available for questions.
Chairman, they'll be presenting that this afternoon, so we're going to...
Well,
Turn your page over.
I did? Okay, never mind. Let me go back to my old one. Let me see.
Landed on the code.
Please forgive me. Here it is. Okay. Take yours. It was wrong. Alan Harris. Excuse me, everyone. We're back on script. Alan Harris, Chief Administrator of Emergency Operations, will provide an emergency management update. Alan?
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. Alan Harris, Chief Administrator with the Office of Emergency Management. Give you a short update. I know you have a lot of work to do today, but a short update on COVID-19. First, I just want to give you an update on the cases. As anyone has seen, if you've been watching the news, the cases have increased. We kind of it's not quite at the level that it's at, but we did expect that things would increase after the holidays, and they certainly have done so. We have seen an increase of cases higher than the first spike, which happened in May and June. So just total for the entire event, 20,616 cases, but current positive cases in Seminole County right now is 3,394. That's the highest we've been, and certainly it's caused a strain on Department of Health and Emergency Management and EMS staff. So that is not a good number. We are seeing anywhere from 200 to into the 300 cases per day in some places. So that has not been good at all. And ALFs in nursing homes, it also rose. So if you remember the last time I was with you, we were talking very low numbers, 20s and 30s. 100 residents right now in our assisted living facilities and nursing homes have COVID, and 35 staff. There are 3 outbreaks in 3 facilities. Infectious disease control measures are being taken place there, as well as we're trying to get vaccine into those locations where the people are not sick, and then additional testing and isolation for those that are well. So we are working with those administrators. Of course, all of the administrators want to try to control this as best as possible. So we're doing what we can in the assisted living facilities and nursing homes. Hospitalizations has also increased. We were seeing hospitalizations in the 50s and 60s the last time I was with you, and then of course today 145. So that has exponentially increased. We were seeing an increase of about 10 additional per week. Many of those are in ICU beds. There are some on ventilators, but that being said, there are plenty of ventilators in the county that are available. The hospitals are able to mobilize additional ICU units if necessary. Advent Health has opened up an additional COVID wing, so they had 2 COVID wings. Those are maxed out. So they have added an additional COVID wing to take in the new coming patients. And this is all part of medical surge. This is all part of their plan. So at this point, the hospitals are stressed as far as staffing, but not stressed as far as PPE or equipment. They still have the ability to surge more, but certainly when you have more patients of COVID, it requires a lot more PPE. It requires a lot more work on each of the nurses and the medical staff, and it is quite stressful for the hospitals. But they are maintaining. Advent Health Altamont did go from green when the last time I was with you, very quickly to red. So they are in now red status. Central Florida Regional Hospital, our trauma center, it has gone to yellow, or stayed at yellow. Oviedo Hospital Medical Center is at yellow, and South Seminole remains at green, actually. So they have not seen they've seen an increase, but not the increase that the other hospitals have seen related to COVID. Why is that? I can't answer that question. It just is where people happen to have gone this time. Our positivity rate, as you can see, is quite dramatically higher than the last time. So this, of course, is very consistent with the number of positive cases and the number of sick people that we're seeing in the community. So at a positivity rate of 14.62, now assisted living facilities and nursing homes that meet CMS requirements are required to test staff twice a week. So that's being done in most facilities at this time. Our daily count yesterday was 9.7, so that tells you what our positive, the people that are going to get tested, that's a very high percentage of those people that are getting tested. Because remember, people are also getting tested if they feel great and they have a procedure coming up, or they're going to go on a travel, or they came in contact with someone, or they just want to get a test. So anyone can get a test now, and of all the people that feel wonderful and go get a test, 9.7 of those are coming back with COVID. And unfortunately, our fatality count has increased. Part of our planning and response is now a monoclonal antibody infusion center. So we have been working with True Health, which is a nonprofit medical organization that we work with very closely, to develop a monoclonal antibody infusion center. This is the same type of treatment that President Trump got when he came down with COVID. You receive the antibodies, and it helps to fight the virus. And many people recover very, very quickly after that. I personally have known someone that was in an ICU, received the monoclonal antibody treatment, and then within a couple days they were back home. So that's how fast that can sometimes work. It all depends on your body chemistry. It depends on the infection. But in many cases, it is doing wonderful things. We have learned, if nothing else, we have learned during COVID that we can be very resourceful people, and that we are technologically much more advanced than we, were many, many years ago. And this is one way, that in less than 1 year, we are actually finding treatments for COVID-19, a brand new virus. So the Florida Department of Health is working on the supplies. We are in the process right now of identifying a site for this. We are looking at something like is on your screen, maybe a pop-up tent type of location, or we are also looking for a hardened structure to open up the site. So once that's finalized, once we get the supplies, Emergency Management, Seminole County, and with your support, we'll also be purchasing some of the supplies to go into the infusion center. Once that's up, Seminole County will have an infusion center here. Currently in Central Florida, there are some infusion centers in Orange County, all affiliated directly with the hospitals. So Advent Health downtown, Orlando Health, ORMC, and then Osceola has one in the Lake Nona area, just south of the Lake Nona area. So at this point, though, there are no infusion centers here in Seminole County, and this will help us to create the infusion center. And I do have to put out a shout out for Dr. Todd Husty, of course, our medical director, which has overseen this entire project. It is something that he is very passionate about, and this will help save lives in Seminole County. Testing continues in the county. We have community-based testing sites, drive-through testing sites, each and every week. Our goal was always to have a test near you within about a 15 to 20-minute drive somewhere in Seminole County each and every week, and we've been able to maintain that. We've been able to maintain our testing in assisted living facilities and nursing homes to help them. As the state moved out a few months ago of the testing business for ALF and nursing homes, we have filled that gap. So we're, in fact, in 2 assisted living facilities today doing testing. Florida Department of Health is doing testing for individuals that are disabled and can't go to a drive-through test site, or they're homebound. And then we also are doing testing in clusters. So if we identify a cluster in a business, or identify a cluster in a faith organization or a nonprofit or something like that, we will go out and test at their request inside of that facility or agency. And of course, this is the big one. We now have the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Seminole County was the recipient of the Moderna vaccine initially, and now we have received two allotments of Pfizer. We received 12,675 a week ago, and then this week we received 5,000, just over 5,000 additional doses. So we have opened up a couple different means for vaccinating people. The first is a fixed point of dispensing at the Oviedo Mall. This is for anyone 65 and older that meets the priority group, and non-hospital affiliated healthcare workers. That's family practitioners, dentists, dermatologists, those types of folks. We also have a mobile dispensing team. The mobile dispensing team is going into neighborhoods, such a low-income, fixed-income, transportation disadvantaged, and 55-plus senior communities, vaccinating people that are 65 and older. So we're going into 55-plus senior living communities, but because of the executive order from the governor, we're only providing vaccine to anyone 65 and older that meets that priority group. And then, of course, non-hospital healthcare workers. We also have a Department of Health vaccination team, which is also going into where we were providing testing for disabled and homebound individuals. Now those individuals may want the vaccine. We're providing it for those individuals. And these are individuals, again, that absolutely cannot make it to a facility. I don't want anyone to hear us on SGTV or or online, if you're watching online, and think that we're just going home to home. We don't have the staff for that. But in certain cases, individuals that, just to give a couple examples, that had just gone through brain surgery a couple months ago, and this is literally a case, we are going to that individual's house. Someone that is fighting cancer, getting chemo treatment at their house, very, very difficult for them to leave. They, there are extenuating circumstances even with that particular case. We are providing direct vaccination to those individuals. And then the Seminole County Fire Department also has a vaccination team, which is going out and doing healthcare staff. So we have a four-prong approach to get vaccines out to the community. It is challenging, I will say, because we don't know when our next dose will be, or we don't know when our next shipment will be. There's no clear supply line. We don't know how much it's going to be. We don't know what it's going to be, and that's important for us because we need to know what it's going to be so we know when to plan out the second dose. If it's Pfizer, it's 21 days. If it's Moderna, it's 28 days. There's different freezing techniques and thawing techniques for each one. And once you thaw it, then you have a certain amount of time before you have to put the shot in the arm. So there's certain issues related to each vaccine and how we handle that. So it would have been nice if it was just one vaccine that we were given, but we were not going to turn down any vaccine. And that is why we bought the ultra-cold freezers. And because we bought the ultra-cold freezers, unlike other counties that did not receive any Pfizer, because they had no way to keep it frozen, we have received now 2 doses, 2 allotments here to our county. So we are being able to vaccinate a few more people. And I think that's it. So that concludes my report. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions?
Good job. Great work.
Thanks.
I have a couple questions,
Yes,
Chairman.
please, go ahead, Commissioner.
Probably worth sharing where the monoclonal antibody, what's the source of it?
Sure. So the Florida Department of Health provides that to us for free. There's no procurement for the antibodies themselves. So so we just make the order and then they'll ship it to us free. There's no cost whatsoever to that.
And what's the derivation of the actual antibody?
It's an excellent question, and next time I'll bring Dr. Husty that can answer the medical side of all those questions.
Since there's so much rumor and innuendo out there, it's probably worth sharing.
Sure.
publicly.
Yeah, and I'll see if he can come to our next gathering. So.
With regard to the infusion site, I can assure you that when infusions are done in a hospital setting, anyone that is insured is billed. Are we doing the same thing?
No, this is, that's the great thing about True Health, is that we are not looking to, this is a safety net, if you will. So if you can get it from a hospital, then you certainly can go and get it scheduled at Advent Health or Orlando Health, the HCA, possibly in the future. But at this particular point, there is nothing there for those that are uninsured. And so this is a safety net that True Health is used to doing every single day, which is why we linked with True Health.
Alan, True Health, if folks do have insurance, they will be billing back.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you have medical insurance, there is some recouping of costs from True Health. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And then the third and last question is, with regard to the positivity rate at 9.7, there was a reference that 9.7 was of those feeling healthy. 9.7 is of all tested?
All tested, yes. Thank you for the clarification, yes.
That's it, thank you.
You're welcome. Any further questions for the commission? For those either here in the audience that have been to the Oviedo Mall and have seen the facility, I just have to say I have had nothing but compliments from everyone. The only complaint everybody has is, when am I going to be able to get their dose and their appointment? And for all of those folks, I think that they understand that we're restricted by the amount of vaccine that we get. But we're opening up those appointments as soon as we know we've got the vaccine. And I just want to tell you, Alan, that we have complimented you a great deal over the course of time, but it's not without meaning, because you and all of the people down there, the Department of Health, Dr. Husky, everybody, Donna, is doing just an incredible job. And, the people are so pleased with the service that they're receiving. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
In a very difficult situation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we're going to go to Nicole, our county manager, and she will provide us an update on the CARES Act.
Bear with me while I get my screen up there. Thank you. So this is really more of a CARES Act recap than an update, because we pretty much wrapped up the program at the end of 2020. Some of you may be aware that the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was the next COVID Assistance Act, extended the date for expenditure of CARES Act money an additional year beyond December 31st of this year. That was not signed into law until December 27th, so we were prepared, not knowing if it was going to be extended, to make a claim on the full $82.3 million of CARES Act funding. And so we have met the criteria for expenditure of those dollars and have submitted, at the very end of this, I'll kind of give you a status of where we are on requesting that, but we have met all of the obligations with respect to requesting full reimbursement for the $82.3 million for the Seminole County community. This slide gives you a recap of what the expenditures were. As a reminder, we had allocated $10 million for small business assistance. We ended up at $12.5 million in assistance. Individual assistance, again, we exceeded the original allocation. Public safety service and health expenditures, we're at $41 million. That includes a set aside in there for additional costs related to vaccination and continued testing that's gone on beyond the December 31st date that was the original closeout of the CARES Act. Our special economic recovery incentives, we've still got $4 million in there. And then at the very bottom, you'll see the replenishment fund. We've got about $2.3 million that is still unallocated for any unanticipated expenses that may come up related to COVID, because we're not sure if we're going to get any more direct funding that is general use funding to our community. Small business assistance, this is just, I always include the slides just so you have a reference for what that program was. At the end of the day, we assisted almost 1,700 small businesses to the tune of $12.5 million. The average award was a little over $7,000. I've included a little metric on here. We're still going through some of the data that we were able to capture through the portal, just to give you an idea of kind of how that money was distributed and what sort of folks were able to get some of that benefit. As I indicated, the Consolidated Appropriations Act did not have any additional direct funding to local governments for things like economic assistance. We are assessing the opportunities for some additional assistance. We do have that $2.3 million unallocated. I'm a little concerned about what we might need that for with respect to the ongoing response relative to vaccinations, infusion centers, et cetera. So we're cautiously keeping that money aside. But there may be some opportunities, either with new legislation or with some of the replenishment funds, to do some additional economic assistance moving forward. I included this slide in here also for your reference, just some of the comments we received from some of the small businesses who we were able to assist through the CARES Act funding. So we've gotten some really positive feedback, and we're really grateful that we were able to help them. Again, a recap of the individual and nonprofit assistance programs. In that regard, we were able to help almost 5,000 households with individual assistance with rental and utility assistance to the tune of almost $20 million. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about some additional funding that we have received at the end of this slide that we can continue to do individual assistance under the new act. There is some direct funding that we'll be receiving, and I'll give you some details at the end of the presentation relative to that. The average award for our individual assistance was about $4,000. As a comparison, and not to say one approach is better than the other, Orange County's average award was about $1,000 per individual. So we were able to give some significant assistance to folks in our community. We were able to give some really significant assistance for folks facing eviction. We received, as you'll recall, in addition to the $82.3 million in CARES Act funding, we were allocated almost $2.2 million of coronavirus funding relief through the SHIP program. Had different criteria, more strenuous criteria than the CARES Act funding did, a lot more paperwork, a lot more, there were some income qualification requirements, et cetera. We used those funds because the application process was more onerous to give folks who needed something beyond the $5,000 relief through the individual assistance program. And we were able to help 441 households through this program. They were able to receive beyond $5,000. We're considering this an ongoing program because it relates to the new funding that we may be getting. As you'll see, we've provided $2.5 million, which is in excess of the almost 2.2 that we were originally allocated. We went back and begged and pleaded, and were able to get the state to give us some additional funding, because we had some folks that still needed assistance. So. We want to continue this program, and I'll talk with you a little bit when we talk about the new funding source through this second relief bill. Again, just some comments that we received from some of our individual assistance recipients. Nonprofit assistance, you closed this program out at your last board meeting, so there's really not anything new to report here. 45 applications were approved. You're closing right in on that $3 million that you allocated for nonprofit assistance. We're continuing to work with them. They need a little bit of hand-holding, some of them, to get their expenditures in. We've given them, I think, until the end of this month to fully submit their reimbursements. The expenditures could not have occurred before or after December 31st, but we're continuing to work with them to get them fully reimbursed, consistent with the agreements that you approved. Public safety services, health expenditures, these are the public agencies that we've been working with, including the county. I have a number for us at $22 million. That does include some unexpended funds for vaccines that we've set aside, and now the infusion centers. Municipalities came in a little bit higher than we had originally estimated. Constitutional officers came in a little bit lower. We expect that we'll continue to get costs from them, and we're able to continue despite the extension of the CARES Act. We had done some moving of the deck chairs, as you'll recall, with public safety salaries. So we knew we would need some flexibility with our governmental partners, because all of them are experiencing expenditures just as we are, beyond what we thought was going to be the original expiration date of December 31st. One of the things that is reimbursable through the CARES Act is leave for employees. There's mandatory paid leave for any absence of employees that is related to COVID, whether it's a quarantine or an actual illness. Our governmental partners are still experiencing those expenses. So you'll see these numbers will change a little bit, and some of that will come out of the, we've got a little bit of cushion in here, but also some of that may come out of that replenishment fund. The tourism industry, we continue to work on getting assistance in some of the additional requests that we've gotten from the tourism industry related to this slide. Workforce development, we're also continuing to work with Seminole State College. There is some money. We put $4 million in special economic incentives, so there is a little bit of wiggle room in this pot of money, this allocation as well. So we'll continue to work not only with the tourism industry, but also with our other business partners to see if there's any opportunities to do some additional sort of broad economic incentives through the remaining funds that we have in that allocation. Actual expenditures to date, just so you know, we've sent 70, either through contract or actual expenditure, $76 million out the door. We've got some stuff that's still in process. And then, of course, we've got the $2.3 million that remains unallocated. But we've done a pretty good job, because we thought we were going to have everything spent by the end of the year. We did a pretty good job getting the money out the door. So we know if we have money to spend, we can do it. Our funding status with respect to reimbursement, we're still where we were when I talked to you in December. We have not gotten the remaining $45 million back from the state, but we're on track to do that. I'm just not sure when, and as soon as we get it, we'll let you know. But we've met all the criteria. We're not concerned about it. We're one of 67, or, well, 55 counties asking for requesting additional funding. They have their own issues they're dealing with too, so they're responding. So the Consolidated Appropriations Act, I mentioned this earlier. This is the relief bill that was signed into law at the end of last year. There is, as I mentioned, no direct funding to local governments as there was in the CARES Act. However, there is a provision in there that discusses rental assistance, and counties with 200,000, a population of 200,000 or more can get the money directly, as some counties got directly through the CARES Act. So we anticipate, NACO did an estimate of all of the eligible counties, and their estimate is we'll get a little over $14 million in rental assistance funding. We're waiting for the final numbers from Treasury, but we anticipate NACO is probably pretty close to the mark on that. We've already submitted the paperwork to Treasury to get the direct allocation. That's in the works. They've confirmed receipt, and we should get our allocation before the end of the month. There are some strings and some criteria tied to this. It's a little, it's not as flexible as the CARES Act funding was. Essentially, it's limited to rental assistance and utility assistance. There has been a question posed to Treasury about whether or not it could be used for mortgage assistance, but based on the language of the Act, that's not very promising. We can give up to 12 months rental assistance and utility assistance, and even there's an opportunity to even extend it an additional 3 months on top of that. There are income qualifications. You have to be at 80% of the average mean income of the county, and the payments are to be made. And fortunately, we had our last program set up this way. The payments are to be made to the vendor, to the landlord, or to the utility provider. There is an exception. If for some reason the landlord and the utility provider won't accept the payment, then you can make the payments to the individual, but they discourage that. We, of course, thought that was a best practice, and that's how we structured our individual assistance program. Because the money has to be expended by the end of this year. It has to be committed by the end of September. So it's a lot of money to spend. We know how much work it was to work through what we had in the CARES Act. So we're talking with Ernst & Young to continue our relationship with them. Now that we're kind of in a groove, we think it'll help us ensure that we get these monies allocated. We're still talking internally about how we're going to structure the program. We can give up to 12 months assistance. I think what we'll probably start with is 6 months assistance. And then if we have additional funding, we can extend that. But we want to make sure we reach as many people as possible. The eviction relief provision of the CARES Act was extended until the end of this month. So we may, in just a few weeks, start seeing folks that are facing additional challenges with respect to eviction. But I'll send the details out to you. We're meeting this week to try to put the structure of this together, but we'll share that with you as soon as we've got more of the details. But we're ready to, we are continuing to communicate with folks that are facing eviction problems. We did the little sort of hotline email. It's not really a red phone hotline, but there's an email that we have in place for folks that are struggling with eviction issues. This will not be strictly for eviction, folks with evictions, but if they meet the income criteria and they have had some sort of some economic hardship created through COVID, eviction or not, folks will be eligible for this program. So with that, I'll answer any questions you have. I don't need any direction from the board today other than for you to just tell us to go forth and put together a program here, and we'll talk to each of you about maybe some input you might have with respect to how we might want to do things differently, or than maybe we did with the individual assistance program. We're going to try to take the best parts of it and maybe take advantage of some opportunities on extending the length of aid that we can give.
Mr. Chairman?
Questions? Go ahead, Commissioner.
Just a comment. I would say I'm totally fine with staff continuing to move forward with the process. I know we have heard, at the beginning of this, a lot of struggles with the portal, a lot of concerns from the community as we rolled it out. And I think we've worked our way through that. I think it's wise to continue to work with Ernst & Young if staff feels that is the most viable path to continue on this. And I would also urge, if we haven't been doing that we stay engaged with our lobbyists in D.C. to help with any of these issues that may come up as we work our way through this. I know they've been helpful in the past, and hopefully we stay engaged with them so that they can assist us with any things that crop up. But I think staff's been doing good work. I would support moving forward with it. A report to our office on significant changes or thresholds that need to be met is fine, but I don't have a need to micromanage it as a commissioner myself, so that's
Mr.
my
Chairman?
position.
Commissioner?
I'm not going to repeat what Commissioner Zimbow said, but I fully concur.
Commissioner Hurd?
I would just ask that the end goal be to minimize homelessness, not just to distribute the funds. So I heard up to 6 months, and if that number needs to be a shorter number in order to maximize the spread, to reduce homelessness, that needs to be the goal.
Sure.
And I think we've all heard that with the new administration and the new legislature up in Washington, that probably another comprehensive program might be coming down. So it's great that you're getting on top of this. And, obviously we'll be looking forward to what that might happen. But thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Lockhart, I believe, is trying to weigh in.
Oh, Commissioner Lockhart?
I'm so sorry. I raised my hand in the thing, but it's
sorry, I
okay.
didn't see
I
it.
understand. I would reiterate everything that was just shared. Additionally, I would ask if we could take a deeper look at how this is impacting our current staff that is required to implement whatever it is that we decide to roll out. Initially, I think we thought this was going to be kind of we're going to get through this and we're going to get it done. And now that it appears this is going to be kind of a protracted event, I'd like to see the county manager come back with a part of her plan that would show how we're going to mitigate some of the impacts on our staff, because they have other work to do that's got to continue on.
I greatly appreciate those comments. I know I see Allison doing a cartwheel in the back of the room because she appreciates that comment as well. We'll give you a whole plan, but we have already gone ahead and put on some temporary staff to assist, and it's also why I think it's really important and I'm appreciative that you've agreed and supported keeping Ernst & Young on, because I am concerned about the impacts, and we're going to talk to each of you individually a little bit about the impact of what the response to COVID and CARES Act has done to our existing staff. Whole nother discussion, but I do appreciate the comments and the sentiment. And I know the rest of the board feels the same way, so thank you. And we'll share with you how we're going to try to keep folks from being any more overstretched than they've already been. Thank you for that.
Any further comments by the commission? All right, thank you very much. Thank you, County Manager. We're going to go in now to the work session. We're going to start with session 4 of the Land Development Code work sessions. This presentation will be led by Eliza Harris Giuliano with Cannon and Associates. Additionally, staff will be here to provide updates on the rural non-residential design standards. Eliza?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Eliza Harris Giuliano. I am an urban planner with Cannon Associates, and most of you have seen me here a number of times already. I'm going to start with just an overview of where we are in the process. Roughly in the middle is the short answer, of going through and taking a kind of comprehensive, holistic view of the Land Development Code and determining where there's opportunity for improvements, and modernization, and for better meeting the policies and within the comprehensive plan and stated from the board. We can do it this way if. Yeah. That's okay. Sorry? Oh, yeah, no, I was just trying to show him where the arrow is, but that's fine. Okay, great. Move that so everyone can see. So we spent the first phase of this project looking at the current regulations and identifying where there was room for improvement, either because of the passage of time or changes in best practices. Now we are focused on some of the bigger picture issues within the Land Development Code and identifying at a high to intermediate level what kind of specific changes would help to improve the code and better meet the goals of the comprehensive plan. This is our second board work session within that phase. And then once we have direction on those bigger picture issues, then we will get into drafting the specific code language, which of course will come back to you for adoption and approval. So today we're focused on 3 areas: attainable housing, mixed use, and non-residential, rural non-residential design standards. Staff will be addressing the last point. These may sound familiar. During our last work session, we dealt with these at a high level, identifying some of the comprehensive plan policies around them and a very big picture direction. Now we're drilling a little bit deeper into specific solutions within each of these areas that could be translated into code language. So let's start with attainable housing. It's generally agreed upon that there is an unmet need within Seminole County and the Central Florida region in general for housing that is attainable for folks at a variety of different income levels. And we're here to identify how the Land Development Code plays into addressing that issue and where implementation might be realistic. So generally, we're talking about 2 buckets of attainable housing. One is market rate attainable housing. This is how can we remove barriers and add incentives within regulations like the Land Development Code to encourage the market to provide a broader range of housing types at a broader range of price points. The second bucket is affordable housing, and this is really about where you have nonprofits stepping in, where you have government subsidies stepping in to provide housing for folks who are at a low enough income that the market cannot provide housing at that level.
Mr. Chairman, should we interrupt when we have questions, or should we wait to the end?
It's up to you, Elijah. You don't mind?
I don't mind.
Then go ahead,
Just-
Commissioner.
Before we move off to definitions.
Sure.
One of the definitions I've been looking for the past couple of years is when we talk about affordable housing, the definition of what transportation is, or transit. And I'm still waiting for someone to give me that definition. Because everyone says that we have affordable housing project that's going in and it meets our transportation needs or transit needs, but no one actually tells me what that is. Is there frequency? Is it distance from the property? I keep on waiting to hear that from someone, and I'm hoping that in this process that we actually get those definitions, whatever they are.
Sure. Yeah, and the basic question is access to transit a prerequisite of accessing any of these standards?
That's why I'm asking it during definitions.
Yeah, and then, if that's the case, then how do we define meeting that standard? I do recall that question from last time, and I can certainly give you best practices, but in terms of providing a specific answer for Seminole County, we'll certainly put that down to address in the future.
Thank you, because I keep on asking it over the past
Sure.
couple of years, and I don't get an answer.
In terms of best practices, generally, it's a quarter mile from bus transit or half a mile from rail transit in terms of distance. And frequencies, you're generally looking for, at a minimum, probably for bus, ideally something like 15-minute frequencies, which is hard to attain with most of our systems here in Central Florida. So where the county would want to fall on that would certainly be a specific policy question.
And I just think that that policy should be in the definition somewhere.
Yes, sir.
Since we're at a point where we are asking questions at this time before Eliza continues, does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, continue, please. Thank you.
And I'm not going through the numbers here because we talked about the area median incomes last time. So I'm going to start within attainable housing, focusing on market rate attainable housing and how the Land Development Code can start to address that. The general purpose here is to construct regulations that would encourage the marketplace to provide a broader range of housing types at a broader range of price points. We're talking in this presentation primarily about single-family detached duplexes, courtyards, in general what we refer to as missing middle housing. The idea here is that the marketplace, not just in Seminole County, but nationally, as well as regulations, are generally well-positioned to produce single-family homes, generally in the form of subdivisions, and apartment complexes. But they are not well-positioned to provide a range of housing types in between, which can increase options for different family types as well as different price points. And these are types of housings that historically in older neighborhoods in Central Florida and around the country you do see more of, such as duplexes, quadplexes, very small apartment buildings, cottage courts. But you don't tend to see those being built new today, in part because of regulations. So we showed some pictures from around the country last time. Now we're going to show some more specific site plan level illustrations of what this might look like. This is an example of a high-density detached single family. So it's a single family home on a smaller lot. And what this does is it decreases the cost of the land for each unit. So this is one way of decreasing the cost of that unit to the ultimate buyer. We happen to call this a paseo. This is what it would look like in 3 dimensions. This is a cottage court. I mentioned that earlier. You'll sometimes also hear it referred to as a pocket neighborhood. This, again, these are detached individual homes. They are generally cottages, so they tend to be smaller, and they're gathered around a common green space so that because each unit doesn't have its individual yard, they have a shared common space that is everyone's yard together. And this allows people to have that enjoyment of some open space that is semi-private while increasing the affordability of the unit. And we've also got some densities that we're showing on the slides. I would like to note that those are net densities, so they don't directly translate to your comprehensive plan densities, which also include things like stormwater and private infrastructure. So the comprehensive plan density would be lower than what you see here, but this gives you an idea of how you can increase the number of units that the marketplace is providing at these price points in order to get people in homes. And this is what that might look like in 3 dimensions. And the same plan featuring that green space that everyone would share. And finally, this is what we call a courtyard building. It's actually a form of a townhouse. What's unique about it, both is that it does allow you to reach, again, house a larger number of people in a relatively small space while creating a really great environment and, again, a common open space that the group can share. So in terms of where this would happen, generally we anticipate that it would happen along the county's identified corridors, and this happens to coincide, not coincidentally, with where the bus routes are, both existing and planned bus routes, especially the planned high-frequency ones that have been identified by links. So here we tried to call out properties that were either undeveloped or commercial properties that maybe now or at some point in the future become underutilized or vacant. These are the types of places that we would anticipate seeing neighborhoods featuring these types of missing middle units incorporated. So they're not necessarily large properties.
When we do this, can we also exclude, since we don't have the zoning ability over cities, can we exclude the city areas? Because in this map here, there are areas that are incorporated, and we should only be really talking about unincorporated areas.
Absolutely. We generally try to exclude those, and if that didn't happen on this map, I apologize.
And looking at the overlay, I can see some areas that are in the cities.
And if I could comment on that too,
Sure.
Chairman. I think that when we were writing regulations, obviously they would only cover the county, but I think identifying the corridors and sharing with the city, showing the cities kind of where those corridors are and what we're looking at is important.
Well, Nicole, I'm not disagreeing with you,
Okay,
but...
I just want to make sure, you don't want us
if-
to not include it in the graphics,
I
but...
want to make sure that we're not looking at this saying, yes, it's a great idea, and we're talking about an area that's an incorporated area.
Sure. Right,
That's all.
understood.
And because if you look at it, roughly percentage-wise, 50% of the county is unincorporated, so if 50% is incorporated, we need to be working with the cities to see where that is.
Absolutely.
So the basic mechanism for implementing this would be creating a new zoning category specifically to enable missing middle housing. And we anticipate that would be the primary mechanism. In addition, if there's a desire to make it geographically specific, either to limit it to a specific geography or to encourage it in a specific geography, a zoning overlay would permit staff and the board to identify those areas where this would be most advantageous. So we've delved a little bit into standards. For instance, right now, the LDR category does not permit some of these types that we talked about, such as the cottage court, because it generally is multiple units on a wholly owned property, as well as duplexes and townhouses. So we're recommending that those would be permitted within this zone, but that's not necessarily required to implement this, because it's quite viable in other in other future land use districts, such as MDR, HDR, and even commercial. One thing to note is if, for instance, these unit types were allowed in a different future land use district, that doesn't change the density. The overall project would still have to meet the maximum density that's permitted in that district. The plan does permit higher maximum densities for designated affordable housing projects within the comprehensive plan today. And we've also looked at the setbacks that would apply. I'm not going to get into great detail on this, but I'd be certainly happy to take any questions. Obviously, when we're talking about these smaller lots, we are talking about more shallow side and rear setbacks. In addition, as urban designers, we actually think that often a shallower front setback can actually be advantageous in terms of increasing the comfort level of people walking on the street. People actually like to feel a sense of enclosure where they feel like the front doors are close to them, as opposed to feeling like they're walking through a parking lot or walking through a field of driveways.
Excuse me, Eliza. Commissioner Lockhart, your hand is up.
Thank you. Could we go back to the slide you were on prior? Yeah. So if I heard you correctly, you're saying that you would recommend that we include the higher density uses of cottage court and duplex and triplex and quadplex into our low density allowable. Can you help me understand why? Because the whole point of those is that they're higher density. So what's the recommendation for including them in low density?
So currently, the Land Development Code, the comprehensive plan allows for an increase from 4 units an acre to 7 units an acre to accommodate affordable housing. So this would be one way of implementing that. In general, from an urban design standpoint, these typologies we see as being compatible with single family because they're a similar form factor. And in fact, in a lot of older neighborhoods, which we think of as predominantly single family, you will see duplexes and triplexes scattered throughout those neighborhoods. In order to achieve this, most likely to reach the LDR density, it would have to be a mix of different types. You wouldn't be able to go in and do an entire townhouse project because you would exceed that LDR density. So it would have to be a mix of types to achieve that density while also having these affordable housing types included. As I said, the success of this strategy is not contingent on making that change, but it is a change that we recommend.
So in our current environment, if somebody wanted to do that, they would just do a PUD?
Correct.
That potentially is a mechanism. I'm not sure if
It is.
Future land use
It
doesn't
is.
permit it, though, they may not be able to do it through the PD mechanism either. Correct. Yeah.
Okay, because from the beginning, you made a statement that stuck with me that our code didn't allow for some of these things. And so I'm going to wait at the end to hear what it is in the code that is prohibiting it. So I'm hoping that's coming.
And I'll jump in. The difference is if you were to make this change and allow these uses in the LDR category, they wouldn't have to come before the board to get a rezoning in order to be able to do them. Because you're correct, they could do it under a PD now. They still couldn't exceed the density, just as Eliza said, but they could do a different housing type, but they'd have to rezone the property. And Rebecca's coming down, maybe to correct me, I don't know.
Good morning. For the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. I just wanted to provide a little bit of clarity. What Eliza is stating is that if we were to adopt an actual zoning district for missing middle housing typologies, if we were to, if the county wanted to consider those zoning districts to be consistent with the low-density residential future land use designation, we would potentially have to amend the comprehensive plan and amend the low-density residential future land use description to include those other housing typologies and to allow higher densities. Right now, we allow 7 dwelling units per acre in LDR for specifically affordable housing. But if we wanted to also allow those typologies for not necessarily designated affordable housing, then we may need to increase the 4 dwelling units per acre to a higher density. However, that's only an option. As Eliza stated, we could just allow these typologies within those urban centers and corridor areas in the specific geographic areas, which typically have higher densities already assigned to them. So I don't know if that provides some clarity, but I hope so.
So that for translation, we can strategically place these in corridors where we believe that there should be high densities instead of just doing a blanket acceptance.
Exactly. So instead, because we'd still have to look at compatibility, so I think that's probably a concern if we've got your typical suburban subdivisions with lower density residential. If we, do just a blanket overhaul or a zoning district, there might be some compatibility concerns.
That's where I'm going to be going a little bit. That's my concern, one of my concerns.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I think maybe to put it in a nutshell, in Commissioner Lockhart with a PD reference, I think the whole intent of this is to get the code and categories put in place so that the development community have a clear path and a map of understanding what is available to them in our community instead of making them go through a PD and going through this entire process of making exceptions to what our code already says. And I think this is a way to entice and allow and send a signal to the community that we are looking to do attainable housing. We are looking to put things in place for our retirees and having a place for them to go, because that's one of the complaints I often hear from our elderly is that, look, I've raised my family, I've done my work, I'm retired, but I can't afford to live in the home that I lived in, but I still want to live in my community, and I still want a single-family residence. I don't want to be in an apartment. I don't want to be here, and we just don't have that product. And now we're forcing people to go through the whole PD process, which is a lengthy and additional cost, which ends up costing the people that we're truly trying to make attainable housing. So maybe that helps with understanding how we get there and the whole purpose of why we want to do this or why we want to consider it.
Commissioner Hur, I saw you move your microphone.
I did move my mic. So all of that makes wonderful sense to me, and I still need to understand how a cottage court environment fits into what's currently a neighborhood of only single-family housing, and those folks thought that's what they were moving into, and now all of a sudden, 3 lots get bought up because the neighborhood has started to deteriorate. So before I get the public outcry, I grew up in a duplex. I get it. But I'm not a fan of driving down a street and seeing a huge Victorian home next door to a duplex. It does not make sense to me. So make sense of all of that for me.
Sure. So backing up a second, this would not enable, for instance, the change to LDR would not suddenly enable people to go into any neighborhood and start to build duplexes and quadruplexes. This is by creating a new zone, there would have to be a rezoning for any specific property to this missing middle zone in order for someone to produce this kind of housing. We generally anticipate that these would be relatively small properties, but not individual lots. Now, there probably are scenarios within some more central communities that are on kind of a more old-fashioned design, like the neighborhood I live in, where it might be appropriate to rezone one cottage court, or it could be, for instance, the redevelopment of an old shopping center along one of our corridors. But the board would have a say on whether that rezoning happens. And in addition, as I mentioned, an overlay could either encourage or restrict this missing middle zone within certain geographic areas of the county.
Further questions?
Sorry, can I add one more thing to that?
Sure.
In terms of the Victorian mansions, there actually is a really strong historic history in older cities of larger homes being subdivided or unsubdivided back to single-family homes. So that's actually something that historically has been relatively common, and as you're going down the street, you see a Victorian mansion and don't realize that there's actually 4 families living in it. That's not always a good solution, but in some places it can be a good solution for both providing affordability and maintaining the viability of that beautiful architecture in those neighborhoods where it's appropriate.
Bryant?
Well, Elijah just took the words out of my mouth. In the federal government, when we travel the country, let me take this off. When we travel the country, we showed pictures all over the place, identify the affordable housing, and you can't do it because of the design standards. Cottage homes that on the front look like single-family homes that blend into a community. So, and what you're talking about so far, you're reducing the cost, the regulatory barriers that add 35% to the cost of a home. You're already reducing it significantly with what Elijah's talking about.
But what we are doing by talking about addressing the comprehensive plan issue is just making it 1 layer deep instead of 2 layers deep, which addresses that cost issue if there is a need for a change in a specific geographic area.
And it is, and for the public, I know this sometimes can be troubling because they don't understand because you can't see. And if you can't see, you don't understand. And if you don't understand the whole thing, then you're naturally pushed back. But I got to tell you, on this topic, I visited areas in Palm Beach, and you would be shocked of multi-million-dollar complexes where there are 1,200 square foot cottages, and the people that are living there are multimillionaires living in a community where there are single-family homes that are 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 square feet. It blends right in, and they're all part of the community and so on and so forth. So it's hard to vision unless you've seen it and understand it, and I just don't want the public to think that it's something that we're going to unplug something out of a existing neighborhood and plug in something that just doesn't match and doesn't belong there. We have to have a place for our firefighters, our teachers, our nurses, our blue-collar workers, and if we don't reduce that regulatory overlay, the cost is driven up. Now we have people driving from Lake County, Volusia County, and further away to come to our community, and I think that's the whole reason we endeavored down this path of looking at this so we could keep those people in our community.
Commissioner Glory?
Thank you. I'm hoping that towards the end of this, we'll talk about how we're going to keep affordable or attainable housing affordable in the housing as years to come, instead of just having it market-driven. Because once we establish it, then the market takes over, and then it no longer becomes affordable or obtainable.
Yeah, and if I can, I think that's more affordable housing than attainable housing. No, I
It's
agree with
semantics
you.
at this point.
Yeah. The one thing that I did want to say is unfortunately, I haven't seen a lot of our requests for PD because they want to do affordable housing. Okay? I see the request for PD because they want more density. And then the density is still market-driven. It has nothing to do with affordable or attainable housing. So I just wanted to put that out for the record right now. And if we can find a way to balance that with, what they're asking for with the additional density, and then again, assuring that there is going to be attainable housing within that, I would be more amenable to looking at that, as opposed to what is happening right now, which is just putting in more density and then continuing on with market-driven housing costs. The other thing that concerns me, and I think it concerns all of us, we see these pretty pictures, but pretty pictures, and then what actually occurs sometimes is not the same thing. And I know that there's no way to control that, although I would like to think that there might be some opportunities for us to ensure that if this is going to be something that we start moving toward, that we have also some sort of design standards in there.
I would agree, and to Commissioner DeLaury's point, which I think we're going to get to in affordable housing, is, we've talked about the land trust concept, and to get to the long-term viability of affordable housing, I think that's ultimately where we should end up or consider being, is with those land trusts and bringing those private entities in to help accommodate that. So to Commissioner DeLaury's point, so we can keep that long-term for at least a couple generations, and give those people the ownership capability, but also the ability for the next owner coming in to have the affordability as well.
Amy, Commissioner Lockhart, I don't see your hand raised, so anybody else? Nope. Okay, please go continue.
One last thing that we wanted to deal with under attainable housing, market rate attainable housing, is minimum home size. This has been identified by the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force as a barrier to affordable housing and attainable housing. It also was addressed as an option in the Seminole County Attainable Housing Report to either reduce or eliminate the minimum home size within the Land Development Code. Our recommendation is to reduce the minimum living area for single-family detached homes to 450 square feet. We think that that is very much a minimum. We don't think you'll see a lot of that, but that was the alternative to eliminating the minimum entirely. And we have an example here of a cottage that was designed to 484 square feet. So there are units out there that exist that are smaller than this, but they would be very uncommon, and even a unit this small is fairly uncommon. We looked at whether there were certain zones that would be more appropriate to think about eliminating minimum living size than others. And the conclusion that we came to was that this really is going to be driven by economics. If you have an existing subdivision with expensive lots, it doesn't make financial sense to go in and build a 450 square foot home in that subdivision. The only place this would make sense is where you have existing lots that are in distress, for instance, where someone isn't willing to come in and build a larger home, or if you did have smaller lots, but nothing about this would change the lot size within existing neighborhoods or within existing zoning districts. So that's our recommendation in terms of minimum home size. And then at this point, I'm going to switch to affordable housing.
Can I stop you there and ask a question? So why 450? If that's not common, how high would you have to go to get to common?
Typically the large developers tend to not build homes smaller than around 1,500 square feet. But that's not what we're trying to accommodate here, because we're trying to reach a broader spectrum of the community. This might be something that either someone would be trying to bootstrap their new home into, or something that a nonprofit might build, for instance, without necessarily having the overlay of of the county subsidizing it or anything like that. So we identified the square footage based on our design work and identifying what a realistic home size is that someone can enjoy, as opposed to getting into the very small kind of transformer homes that you might see. So this is what we thought was a realistic minimum from a design standpoint. And from that point, it would be letting the market decide what people want to live in and what they can afford. And I'd be happy
Could
to
we go back
continue.
that one slide, please? I'm not done with the 450 yet.
Further back?
Yeah, no, right there.
Yes.
Can you give us some examples of what people have done for minimum size square footage? Maybe that can help us out.
I can come back with examples from
Not
other
today,
places.
but come back at a later date.
Sure.
I don't feel comfortable with the 450 yet.
Well, I think, if I'm understanding, that's just a suggestion.
I realize that, and that's why I'm asking for examples.
Yeah, and actually,
I think
sorry.
this body would have to make that decision on what that minimum would start at.
That's why I'm asking for examples.
Yeah.
And I will say there are many examples of communities that have eliminated the minimums altogether. So that's also an option.
Well, they show us those examples.
Sure.
I think many of us will recall when a few gentlemen, a few folks that were doing the small homes came
Tiny
in
homes.
and tried to show us,
yeah.
those 150 square foot and 250 square foot.
Transformers,
homes.
but,
Yes.
I mean, this is really a good conversation. I mean, we have non-conforming parcels throughout the entire community. It's something that I've discussed back as far as my plan and zoning days is you have these lots that are non-conforming that you can't build on, that are sitting between other homes. This is something we should be looking at is what happens with those parcels. And of course, it would have to be in the proper geographic area and the proper, density as far as compatibility. But there certainly are, lots that are quarter acre or triangle shaped and these types of things that from whatever parcel splits happened years ago are just sitting there doing nothing. They're not on the tax roll with any improvements. They're not serving a purpose. They may or may not have access to infrastructure. So I think it's something we have to look at on a broader base as another option.
And I should also mention that some of the tiny homes you may have seen are often not on a permanent foundation, so they wouldn't be able to be built under many of the existing zones anyway. This is not that instance. This is a permanent home built, site built. And in addition, I would also mention that going back to the history again, it was fairly common early in the 20th century for people to build a home and then do multiple additions onto that home. That has become less common in modern times for a lot of reasons around mortgages and the way that our developers are structured, but that is also something that could happen via this mechanism. Someone could build this small unit as an initial start and then build additions onto it in the future, so that as they grow their family or get married or what have you.
But in those times, nobody needed a permit, engineering plans. They did it. Their brother and their uncles and the family all got together and put an addition on when there was a new child coming into the family. But today, you got to jump through a lot of hoops, hire an engineer or hire an architect, bring plans down to the county to get approval and write a check, which families often can't afford to do today.
Commissioner Zimbauer, I just wanted to say that I have a 1950-something home, and it started as a 750 square
Right,
foot house.
right.
It's now
That's
over
right.
2,000 square feet. So
right.
it does happen, but that was, I think, the 50s is the last time it really was, was even something that people thought of, is build a small house and then expand it.
And for the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. I just wanted to add to Commissioner Zimbauer's statement about the smaller lots within the antiquated plats. This is something that I think would help accommodate development on those lots. Our comprehensive plan does allow development within those antiquated plats without applying the lot size variance, especially within our CDBG areas. So if we do allow a smaller home size, it would accommodate and could encourage development on those types of lots. Right now, some of our single-family zoning districts only require a minimum of 700 square foot home. So I think that is R1BB through R1 only allows 700 square foot currently. So, thank you.
Well, and I'll just point out as the homeowner that grew up this way, the first thing you're doing on this house is you're closing in the porch and you're getting close to 700 square feet.
Right, exactly. That's right.
And you're probably not pulling a permit to do it, and you're not, let me just walk you through how you do
The
that.
second
That
way
is
is
you
if
do it
there's
with
a
your brother-in-law.
garage, you close in the garage.
Right.
So, yeah, we got to contemplate that.
That's right. As a teenager, my room became the enclosed garage.
If you'll allow me to add my biographical note, I actually also live in a 1950 home that's not at 2,000 square feet yet, but the room we sleep in was clearly an addition because I can see the outside wall between my bedroom and what used to be the house, and we're in the process of doing an addition, and we just had a baby, so there you go.
Yep.
That's right.
So we're all going down memory lane.
That's
here.
right.
If, with the chairman's direction, I can keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay, so now we are shifting to affordable housing, which we're defining as, this is the subsidized affordable housing. This is where you have an agreement with the developer that they will maintain this housing as affordable for some period of time. And I don't think we addressed this time, but we absolutely think land trusts are a great mechanism for doing that over a very long term.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'd have a question before we move on, and I don't mean to keep on going back, but this is a work session. At one point, you talked about with the courtyard cottage homes, you talked about moving them closer to the roads, correct?
Sir, yes, sir.
I'd like to see some analysis on what type of road it is. Is it a 2-lane, 4-lane, 6-lane? Because I know for a fact that when I'm walking down a busy road, I don't want to be right up against the road. I want to be away from the road, and if you have a house or right up a building or structure up against the road, I may not walk there because it's so busy.
We can certainly address that when we get into the detailed standards. We are typically not talking about a cottage fronting 1792, for instance.
Well, I
We're
understand
talking
that,
about.
but that's, I want to make sure the general public, or our conversation is talking about that, because I can tell you, when you're putting a small building up against a major road, if there's no regulations, people are not going to, because of the noise of the traffic and/or the pedestrian issues of walking on that road, we're going to have additional issues at that point.
Yes,
Chairman?
that's absolutely something we can address in the detailed standards.
Well, and while
Seems
we,
we're all engaged in this.
and while we say we don't have that, as the person that doesn't have the experience that you guys have, we do have that in the community. There are porches right up against 434.
Right.
And I
We do.
realize, so.
With
so
sidewalks.
We do
We-
really,
it's-
there's sidewalks, but you got cars going by at 55 miles an hour.
Right.
Maybe shouldn't be, but those are the things that we really need to not only contemplate, but communicate appropriately that where we think we're headed.
Yeah,
And infrastructure was a whole nother line of questioning that I withheld on.
I agree.
Correct. I mean, and you have areas of our community where, you have, the front yard is the entire yard that has a chain link fence around it up against the roadway. I mean, that's just what happened in the 50s, 60s, and so forth, and there's certain areas that we have that. And the reality is if you travel around the country and you look at communities, it's not unusual to have this type of housing, which is on a major corridor, which is very close to the roadway. And they're riding bicycles and walking up and down the sidewalks and doing those things. I understand Commissioner Delari's concerns. with the crossings of the intersections and people not crossing in the intersections and with pedestrian accidents we have. But I think that's something we could address, through the code and design standards, certainly.
And this is in the mixed-use section, but we're actually explicitly addressing the
And just that
setbacks.
And just that you know, since we're going down memory lane.
Sure.
I grew up on a 6-lane road.
Okay. And a lot of,
It's a walking miracle.
You got PTSD.
also, one thing that's important to recognize is a number of instances where you see these homes on major roads like that, the road was widened at some point after the home was built or after it was platted. So that's another thing that's fairly common.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we go into affordable housing, we've been going on with this. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll be back after that, and we'll start affordable housing right afterwards. Thank you very much.
One thing that's probably worth mentioning with respect to missing middle and the attainable housing that we're talking about is sort of a good news, bad news situation. Right now, there are not developers lining up to do this. So this is not a situation where you turn on the tap and you're going to see a flood of this. That's bad in terms of producing new affordable housing, but it's good in terms of not having to deal with a huge change. We're really talking about removing barriers to allowing the market to be creative, and there are actually, there's a network of small developers that are doing one building at a time, trying to go into neighborhoods and make these kinds of things happen. So I did think that was important context to add to this conversation. So with that, we'll move on to affordable housing. So here we're talking about contractually affordable housing where our developer has made a commitment to the county and to others that the housing will meet certain price points and will meet those price points either at initial sale or over a long period of time. Earlier, Commissioner Delary mentioned the Community Land Trust, which we think is a great mechanism for doing that. We don't necessarily want to restrict something like this to only one mechanism because there are a number of different approaches and it varies a lot depending on whether you're doing for sale or for rent. But what we are talking about here is mainly the dimensional requirements and the typologies that could help make that happen. Right now, the county has a zone RAH, which is the Affordable Housing Dwelling District / subdivision. So we took a look at that and analyzed how it was performing and whether there was room for improvement. Oh, I think there we go. Okay. So the existing RAH zoning district, good news, it permits a mix of housing types. In fact, it looks kind of like it was written to allow a portion of the missing middle that I just talked about. It also has some other flexibility. For instance, it allows for some flexibility in street design that could lower costs to the development and enable lower costs for the housing. What's a little bit concerning is only 2 projects have been built under this designation so far. This designation is structured so that developer goes and requests this zone, so there's no zones out there that had this designation already. It's something that people go in, request, and then get something built. In fact, there's a clawback provision that if you don't build anything, it may be returned to the old zone. The other thing that's concerning or interesting about those 2 projects that were built is neither of them took advantage of the mix of housing types that the zone allowed. They built only single-family homes. And once we looked at the zone, we realized why. So starting at the big picture, there are district size requirements. Right now, it must be 5 acres or more, and 100% of the units within that development must be designated affordable. So when we look at that, we identify a couple of things. One, the best practice among affordable housing advocates today is actually to have mixed income housing. So we make 2 recommendations based on that. One is to lower the acreage limit so that you could do smaller projects, which would be, for instance, maybe in one of these older neighborhoods that's in a distressed situation, and that you might allow 50% of the housing to be market rate, because there's research showing that kids do better, that families do better when they're in mixed income situations, rather than when you isolate all people of a lower income together. And we also find that in the right locations, market rate folks are happy to move into these units, the other 50%. So the recommendation here is that we do want an upper limit. We don't, the other piece of that is we don't want a huge area that is only affordable housing. So that's why we're recommending, in addition to the lower limit of 2 acres, also adding an upper limit of 15 acres if you're doing only affordable residential. If you're doing the mixed, then you wouldn't necessarily have that limit because you are having that mix happen naturally. Another thing we noticed about this zone is that it does allow for some mix. It allows for single-family detached, duplex, triplex, and 0 lot line. Our recommendation here would be to broaden that a bit to match the recommendations we're making on attainable housing to encompass all of the missing middle, such as these cottage courts, townhouses, and sixplexes. We're also recommending that this zone right now is written to really deal with these lower density situations. But in our discussions with staff, we talked about why do we have this RAH zone to begin with, such as to flag it so that the county knows and can help the project along. Because in some cases, you might have a project that comes through under an existing zoning district and the county doesn't even know it's designated as affordable housing. So if you also allowed other projects such as apartment complexes to come in under this RAH zone, then the county would be able to coordinate with the appropriate agencies. Now, that doesn't mean you would allow apartment complexes where you wouldn't allow them now. It just means that you would allow them with this affordable housing designation and the incentives in terms of review that come along with that. The current code does allow some non-residential uses, primarily around childcare, such as VPK, also group homes and home offices. However, in order to do that, you have to have a minimum project size of 10 acres, which means that, and you're limited to 10%. So that means that you have to get to 10 acres to do half an acre of childcare center. We weren't sure that that made sense because it really discourages this mixed-use option. And the uses we're talking about, it's not a gas station, it's a childcare center. So it's something that's a benefit to the community. So our recommendation is that additionally allowing live-work units, which would allow community members to operate their own businesses out of those units, which can be really a good way of supporting small business. In addition, we recommend reducing that minimum acreage size to 5 acres and increasing the amount of allowable non-residential use to the greater of either 2 acres or 20%. Essentially, you're allowed to have one of these facilities, such as the child care facility, in a 5-acre project. And as you get larger, you may allow more of that. Of course, you don't want the affordable housing zone to be entirely non-residential, but it needs to allow for these things to happen in a realistic manner, because that 0.5 acres just isn't viable for most of the uses we're talking about. Now getting to, I mentioned earlier that we've got this zone that's set up to encourage a variety of different housing typologies and the benefits that that has for affordability, but we didn't actually see that happening. Well, this is the reason that we would expect. Currently, the setbacks really discourage triplexes and duplexes because they're much bigger for those types of units. In addition, from an urban design standpoint, the last thing you want to do if you have different typologies next to each other is to make the denser typology stick out like a sore thumb. What you want to do is have things blend together. So having them have, what you want to do is have the Victorian mansion and the Victorian quadplex that's been subdivided look very, very similar. So having the same setbacks helps to do that. So that's what we recommend here, is changing this zone to have the same setbacks throughout. And essentially, these are similar typologies to what we're recommending in the attainable housing missing middle section, so we recommend that we use the same standards that we promoted there. We also recognize that there's concern about adjacencies and compatibility, so we're recommending that there is a provision for that in the current code. We think it's a little bit aggressive, and we're recommending instead that we're doing an analysis separately of buffers, and we'll address how buffers fit into this. And we also don't want, if it's an infill context, for it to stick out. So in an infill context, we recommend essentially that you match your neighbors so that you fit into the community rather than standing out from the community. If it's more of a subdivision condition where it's a subdivision backing up to another subdivision, then what we recommend is having some step backs to make sure there aren't massive height differences. So that concludes the affordable and attainable housing section. Be happy to take any questions before moving on to mixed use.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any question, but I do have a comment. I think as we consider this, I think this plays into topic that Commissioner Laurie brought up which is the transportation aspect, what that really means, and we've discussed that in the last few years. But I think we have to have an understanding that a couple things. We are in a growing urban area in close proximity to Orange County and the city of Orlando. We don't have the pleasure of some of the things that we had the pleasure of 30, 40 years ago, of single-family homes, McMansions, and so forth. By default, we have to make a decision. Are we going to try to keep our retirees and our seniors in close proximity to the place that they ran their businesses, were employed, they have their families, as well as some of the concepts of the utility and ancillary uses on some of these parcels to be considered is that takes impact off the transportation. If they're conducting business with their child care or working in the same exact community instead of commuting outside, all that I think we have to look at as a larger picture on how that impacts our infrastructure moving forward with the land use and how that best fits. And I know there's been some concern about converting too much commercial and industrial property and the limited amount we have in this county. So I think we have to look at that very closely as well as moving forward, where these areas ultimately would be best suited for the product. So.
I just wanted to say, though, when in discussing that, these concepts look like they are more suited for urban core areas. At least that's the way I look at it. And that specifically then is the cities in this county, and then since they are predominantly where the urban core are. So if we're going to do something like this, I think we also need to reach out and work. And I think most cities have incorporated things like this into their, and higher densities into their urban cores, but I think that clearly is something that is a coordinated effort that we need to work with the cities to get opportunities within their core area, urban areas, so that these concepts will be available.
Mr. Chairman?
Great.
I'm going to expound on what you just said, Mr. Chairman. Have any of the cities adopted any of these principles? And if so, have any of them come into its own so we can see the examples of them?
I would say the city of Orlando has done a lot.
Seminole County.
Oh, Seminole County. I am less familiar with
Well,
I'll have to go and look at that.
Castleberry and Altamont have done some of
Altamont
this.
around
That's right.
Crane's Roost has
That's right.
definitely done this, but
And now Castleberry and their new city core and so forth in their downtown area have done.
Those would be excellent examples.
Sure.
So I'd like to actually take a look at those and see,
Absolutely.
is that something that we should be looking at and how to extend that?
Well,
And if there is an avenue to extend that, because it may already
Again-
be developed.
yeah, again, I think that it's something that if we're going to do this, it has to be a coordinated effort with the seven
That's what I'm
cities.
trying to do.
And like you're saying, and Ms. Harris-Giuliano, I recognize that you said about Orlando, and that is clearly that goes without saying that they have done this, but maybe in our next discussion, you might want to look at what's happening in the local area, as should our staff, because I really think that, again, this is not just exclusive to the unincorporated areas of Seminole County. In fact, I think that these things are more likely, would be more likely successful in our cities, especially in the urban cores where people can walk.
I disagree with you.
And I think part of our interlocal agreements should address this. And the one thing I haven't heard I'd like to hear is height restrictions and how that plays a role or may not play a role moving forward. Because we know we have multiple cities that have relaxed and increased their height restrictions and going up. And that may be appropriate also for us to be discussing.
Commissioner Delory?
And once Commissioner Zimbow mentioned height, it triggered, look at Griffin Farms in Lake Mary. Griffin Farms, I think it's called Griffin Farms in Lake Mary.
Yes.
I think they did something along these lines, if I'm not mistaken. And it'd be nice to see how that turned out and what we should or shouldn't do.
Talking about memory lane, I'm sorry, let me just talking about memory lane and getting this out, since we mentioned Crane's Roost. Back in the 80s, when we were developing that, and I was still on the commission in Altamont Springs, one of the things we did with Florida area ratio was allow additional floor to area ratio within the Crane's Roost area if they were doing businesses that we felt were important to the live, work, play,
We did that,
walking. Yeah, and one of them, I mean, we're talking about back in the 80s, so I know that the cities did. One of them was like childcare. If they put a childcare facility in there, they would be able to get additional density. Commissioner Herr?
So 2 thoughts on the information you're going to bring back. One is, I really want to be able to distinguish between rental and ownership. That's an important distinction for consideration. And then the second thought is, I don't just want to look at Seminole County. I'd like to look at the best solutions, I don't care where they are in the country, for a similarly situated geography, right? So where we are in our growth and development, bedroom community to the larger community, pretty high standard of expectation in terms of lifestyle, and how did they do it? So, let's sort of expand our vision.
Then my comment was basically, I'd like to see what the cities are doing, but to see what other areas do, I have no problem with that.
Yeah, it sounds like one issue is one of best practices, of which we want to look very broadly, and the other issue is one of coordination, which
Correct.
is more specific to the cities within the county. And I would note also, we're actually now shifting into discussion of mixed use and infill, and there are some great examples of that within Seminole County cities. What I'm less familiar with is the missing middle piece specifically. I happen to be very familiar with that in the city of Orlando because in my neighborhood, there's a lot of it. And they also recently made some changes. For instance, they put in a duplex ordinance that they had already permitted duplexes, but they put more design parameters around how those could get built within the existing communities. Another national example, again, we can certainly come back with more, but I am not proposing this for Seminole County, but the most prominent national example right now around missing middle is the city of Minneapolis has proposed or adopted citywide to allow quadplexes in basically all of their neighborhoods with the idea that they are compatible with single family. That's an older city, and they're not structured the same way Seminole County is. They're not in sort of pod-like subdivisions as much. They're primarily an older city, so it's a very different structure. But they are looking at, that's one of the most aggressive examples nationally.
Please continue before we ask more questions.
So shifting to mixed use and infill, this is exactly the same slide you saw last time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but essentially the comprehensive plan gives us a lot of good direction on what the county wants to see when mixed use and infill development happen. Where could it be? And Commissioner Delary, this one absolutely shows what you're looking for in terms of the corridors minus the cities. So this is the red there is the portions of the identified corridors in the comprehensive plan that are within the unincorporated Seminole County, as well as the centers that are in unincorporated Seminole County. So you can get an idea of how much land there is in these corridors. Of course, not all of that land is developable, and some of it is already developed, but that gives you a sense of where this would be realistic.
And also with that slide, there are some areas that they're going to incorporate into the cities as well. So just pay attention to that.
Sure. What is mixed use? Fundamentally, we're talking about areas where people can comfortably walk from one use to another use. And that could be within the same building, or it could be buildings next to each other. We call this vertical mixed use when it's in the same building, or horizontal mixed use if it's a single project in which there are multiple uses. It's not sufficient for them to be built by the same developer. They need to be easy and comfortable to walk between. Something that we think is important here is when we're talking about mixed-use development, what we're really talking about is mixed-use corridors. And in fact, you saw that we see most of this happening along our corridors. So it has less to do, in many cases, with whether an individual development is mixed use, and more whether you have a mixed use culture and a mix of uses along a corridor which people can comfortably walk between. Projects, of course, vary in size. For larger projects, you probably would want to ensure that there is a mix of uses within that project because it takes up a big chunk of the corridor. But there very well may be smaller projects where that individual use doesn't have to be a mix of uses in order to participate in the activity of that mixed-use corridor. So our recommendation here is 15 acres. If you're greater than 15 acres, we would want that to be a mixed-use project. That also tends to discourage kind of larger commercial or multifamily properties that are too low density to really actively participate in the mixed-use corridor. What is important is that every project must contribute to the walkability, bikeability of that corridor, as well as allow for people to drive efficiently between where that's necessary. The regulation should also allow for mixed uses to evolve over time. So once a project is approved within a mixed-use corridor, if you have apartments and someone wants to add a corner store into that project, that's something that would want to be encouraged rather than discouraged. Because even if it's not economically viable now, it may be economically viable in the future. And actually, this is actually a photo of Winter Park Village. But what you see, and it's not perfectly designed, partially because it's from multiple parties, but what you've seen happen in that area is that new developments have been built around it by different developers so that people can walk to that Winter Park Village center, in addition to the mixed use within it.
Commissioner Lockhart was raising her hand. Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner.
Thank you. If we could go back and talk about the mixed-use individual parcels that projects have the ability, not every project must be mixed-use to be part of a mixed-use corridor. And I think that currently, in some of our HIP-TI designations, there's some differentiation, and maybe Rebecca can tell me whether I understand this correctly or not. In our HIP-TI corridor in the Markham Woods National Parkway area, we're required that each parcel that comes in must have a certain mix of mixed use, but maybe in the airport target industry zone, that's not required. And is that true?
For the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. So the HIP-TI, Future Land Use Designation, does require a certain percentage mix by project. So for example, the HIP-TI, the target industry uses, must make up more than 50% of the square footage, and you can have residential uses, but they have to make up less than 50% of the square footage. In airport, in the HIP airport land use designation, the mix of land uses is based on the entire acreage of the future land use designation. It's not project-based. So
Okay.
the mix of uses is done in two different ways in those land use categories.
Rebecca, I'm sorry, is there a requirement for residential in
That's what I
HIP-TI?
think the
No,
question
there's no
is.
requirement.
Right.
It's if you want to
that's
do
clarified.
residential, then that's you're permitted to do the mix in that way.
It could
Commissioner,
only be targeted industries. It doesn't
Correct,
have to
yeah.
be a mix.
I think Commissioner Lockhart had a follow-up
I'm
question.
sorry.
No, that's all right.
No, that's okay. What I'm pointing to is that consistency is important not only for us, or at least understanding the rationale when there's deviation, but also for our citizens. I think if we're going to go down this path of now creating yet another opportunity with this mixed-use corridor district, and whether or not the mixed use has to be by parcel or by area, maybe it's just because I'm here and I'm not there with you all. This is feeling overly complicated, maybe. We're adding more layers, not making it less complex. Is that
So
my sensing that?
And I don't know if this will provide clarification, but I think what Eliza was alluding to is that our MXD future land use, which is our mixed land, it's a land use category that we have separate from the HIP-TI land use designations. requires a mix of uses and has certain design standards within it, but we also have language in there that basically says you can develop under your existing land use as well. So there's no incentive to develop as mixed use. So if if you have mixed use, but but your underlying is commercial, then you can develop as commercial. You don't have to change to do the MXD. If that makes sense.
I'll catch up.
So there's no requirement in MXD, there's no requirement to develop as mixed use. You can still develop as single use because there's sort of an exception written into the comprehensive plan.
Okay.
And I think on the HIP TI, Mr. Chairman, I think some of the confusion is, and I want to make sure we're clear on this with the HIP TI. HIP TI is for that targeted high-intensity use for that target industry, and they are not required to do residential, but they can do residential, and many of our HIP TI developers who have come in have taken advantage of that residential capability.
Opportunity.
It's not mandated that they do it, but they've taken advantage of that. But they certainly could come in, and there is, I think Tom Green did the place down there at Lake Mary Boulevard. It's yet to come out of the ground, but it doesn't have any residential with it. It's commercial and hotel with shopping, et cetera, mixed use type setup. But
I believe that from my understanding, and Commissioner Delory was here when they did it, but the HIP TI was to promote the commercial and industrial, and only as a complement was there to be residential. Unfortunately.
Just for the record, I was not here when they established HIP TI. That was in the early 90s.
Okay, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. But I will say that, but all of us have that understanding. Unfortunately, what has occurred lately, because it is popular right now, is that it has been more promoting residential than it has been what an original intent was.
But they still have a requirement of 50% minimum of the target industry.
Unless they change the zoning.
Right, exactly.
And we did go through the mixed-use future land use districts last time, so I didn't want to bore you with the same thing, but we are primarily looking at MXD and possibly urban centers and overlays is what we're thinking about here. Obviously, the target industry is a very specific example. Again, we're not doing your comp plan, but I can say, generally speaking, most areas, particularly areas with a lot of suburban development, are over-retailed, and so a lot of the opportunity is on retail parcels that are either vacant or underperforming along corridors. Now, that's different than industrial, which is well outside my area of specialty, and that's where the target industries are probably going to come in more into play. Being over-retailed is not a huge economic generator. Now this is, if you thought that was complicated, this is going to get a little bit technical. And so just on the previous point, what we're trying to address is that there's a temptation to identify a specific percentage when you're getting into mixed use, and that's very difficult to do in a rational way. For instance, if you had an apartment complex and you have one store that provides milk and bread, that intercepts trips that would otherwise go down that roadway. So it's not necessary that you have retail on the first floor of everything in that community in order for it to be mixed use, because seriously, I don't buy that many dresses. I don't need a dress shop. Dress shops are wonderful, but I don't need a dress shop to be downstairs from my apartment. I need a place to get a cup of coffee, and I need a place to get some food. So when we think about the average daily needs of people, it actually ends up being a narrower segment of uses that they need in close proximity versus the overall retail of the region.
So let me ask you this question then, and I'm not trying to undermine any discussion because I think it's all healthy stuff. With the way that things are changing these days, shouldn't we also require for delivery lockers? Because most everyone is shopping lately online. Don't know how people are going to go back to retail.
I can tell you something that is probably worth looking at but perhaps more of a private sector issue is for apartment buildings in particular, how they deal with packages. I've seen this happen with some of the apartment buildings in my area, has gotten very complicated. They're
actually
not set up to deal with the number of packages they're getting.
I've actually seen it where I went to gas station, 7-Eleven, and they had a locker there
Yeah.
for Amazon. And you put your code in, you pick up your package.
Yeah, in most big cities, my daughter, who lives in DC, lives in a facility where that is very much like what's being talked about here, where there's a Whole Foods on the lower floor, and a beauty salon, and a gym. And then on the second floor, part of her amenities is an office center with partitioned areas where Amazon, Walmart make deliveries respective to her unit, that she can go in, just put her code in, walk in, get her packages, and they're actually alerted. She's alerted by management that there's packages in her thing. So I mean, there's a lot of that.
Because I could see it being a need in residential neighborhoods as well, to reduce the frequency of delivery trucks.
Right.
Rebecca?
Sure, if-
You might as well just stay on the front row.
Okay. It's good exercise. And just to add to that conversation, my son just moved into an apartment in Griffin Farms, and I think the private sector is addressing that issue because on the first floor of his apartments, they actually have huge lockers for the package delivery.
Well, I was very inquisitive when I saw it at the 7-Eleven at Redbug and Slavia. It's right there.
Yeah, and in my neighborhood too, the 7-Eleven, they have Amazon lockers. But I think the newer apartment complexes are addressing that need within their buildings.
So I'm certainly having those as an allowable use would make a lot of sense. I don't know that they'd be a difficult thing to require.
Conversation.
So getting into, if we don't want to set specific percentages of how much mixed use you would have on a lot, then how do we encourage mixed use? I actually did I was working for MetroPlan, our firm was working for MetroPlan a few years ago, and I actually did a countywide survey of how different jurisdictions apply mixed use throughout the region. And the answer was, it's all over the place. Every local jurisdiction, including counties and cities, deals with mixed use a little bit differently, and quite a number of them dealt with mixed use on the books in a certain way, but hadn't actually implemented. This was a few years ago. Hadn't actually implemented it yet, so they didn't have a sense of how it worked on the ground. So based on that research, what we found the most effective way to encourage mixed use, two of the most effective ways to encourage mixed use is to allow what we call stacking and to allow for shared parking. Both of those things are really an incentive to the developer to be able to create more development on that lot by mixing uses. Now, shared parking I think is fairly straightforward. It means you allow office users to use a parking lot during the day, and then residential users, for instance, will come in and use that at night. And that reduces the amount of land that's devoted to parking, which has all sorts of benefits. Stacking, what that means is that essentially if you allow, say, 20 units an acre on a given site, and then you say, well, what if somebody wants to do commercial? Do we have to take away a certain number of units so that they can build that commercial? Well, at the densities that we're looking at, that really isn't necessary, because what you want to do is actually encourage more of the complementary use to come in, so that, for instance, they can share parking, so that they can, because they aren't going to produce the same number of trips that a non-mixed-use project would. So what we would suggest instead is to allow the same number of units to be built along with additional commercial, rather than penalizing them for doing mixed use, essentially, which is what the other way of doing mixed use. So that would be our recommendation in terms of the most effective way to encourage mixed use.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes?
I like that idea, but what I'm concerned about is the parking, because then the next conversation is, how do you park it? And it just needs to be some dialogue, maybe not today, but how do you park that type of space?
Sure. And, every project that comes in has to have minimum required parking, which can be, eventually you can start to go up with the parking into structured parking. So the amount of land at this density probably isn't the prohibiting factor. And then you can also start to share that parking within reason. And one of the things that we could do as part of this land development update is provide a matrix that directs people on how much parking they can reduce with that complement of, say, office or residential or other complementary uses using the same parking spaces.
I'm glad you used the word reduce. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the whole ideology behind this is, as time goes on with the mixed use, you'll find that a lot of the residential users don't even own transportation. They either take Uber or a rideshare program, or they're walking in close proximity.
Depending upon where you put this,
Right.
you're going to be encouraging some of that.
Absolutely.
Or if you're putting it in the wrong place, you're encouraging.
Doing just the opposite, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, shared parking is really the minimum that you can do to encourage saving land by allowing that parking to share. And on top of that, other reductions can be appropriate depending on where you're located or depending on what kind of alternative transportation is available, such as being near transit. With the right frequencies and the right mode of transit. So that was a lot about the kind of the intensity of the sites and the uses. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about design. What's typical in a mixed-use environment to encourage that walkability is when we're talking about setback lines, what we're really talking about is build-to lines. You could also call that a maximum setback. People in general would rather be walking past a building, front doors, store shop windows, rather than past an empty parking lot or even a full parking lot. And what you see on the screen is an example within the same community. On the left, that's that active frontage that people enjoy walking past. And on the right, where the parking lot is up against the street, and it creates a discontinuity within that environment. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I didn't catch any people in that photograph. Now, there are variations in build-to lines that can make sense, for instance, to allow for outdoor dining or civic or park spaces. So it's not a hard line necessarily, but we want to be careful about what happens in that zone if we want people to feel comfortable walking. Now, not every street can have that Main Street feel. So as part of these mixed-use projects, we need to identify where that kind of activity can happen and where more flexibility needs to be permitted. So how you organize these is important. So we've identified 3 different typologies essentially to kind of keep, we're trying to provide enough complexity to deal with this mixed-use environment, which is a little bit more complicated than your standard subdivision or strip mall, while keeping it still fairly simple. So we've narrowed down to 3 different typologies. One is active frontage. This is your main street. This is where you'll have shopping, dining, maybe park spaces. So there are specific standards that we would apply to that type of environment, such as wider sidewalks, certain types of landscaping that provide shade, for instance, but don't block the storefronts that people are trying to view. The second category is what we're calling passive frontage. So this is where that ground level isn't active, but it can still be quite urban. So it could be ground floor residential, ground floor office. You might have banks, lobbies of apartment buildings, or townhouses on this kind of frontage. And you still need sidewalks to accommodate people walking to and from their destinations, but not necessarily quite as generous because you're not worried about sidewalk dining or sidewalk sales or anything like that. And the number of people would be smaller.
That's it.
And then finally, the third typology is service frontage. We need a way to get, this happens to be the service entry for a Publix. We need a way to get cars in and out. We need a way to get goods in and out. So acknowledging that we need these service areas and making sure they're in the right place is important. And here you don't have that build-to line because you do need areas where that's not required, both because you don't have enough building to go around and because you need these loading areas. Now, what we don't want to see is inconsistency. So this is an example of where you've got right adjacent to each other, essentially an active frontage and a service frontage. And that is where things start to get a little bit uncomfortable. So that's not something we would want to encourage. So this is looking at a historic community and broadly identifying what that might look like. So you've got that active A frontage along the main street. You've got less active frontages along the side street, and then you've got service areas, making sure goods and cars can get to those locations. The other thing that we need to address is transitions to existing neighborhoods. Our recommendation here is within 100 feet of an existing single-family neighborhood that you would be limited to 3 stories. Buffering requirements are also being reviewed as a separate part of this code update. Again, a kind of a design thing, to the extent that you have shade structures like colonnades and awnings, you want to make sure that those can go over the sidewalks. Very often, these are going to be private sidewalks, so we're not dealing with public right-of-way. These are going to be in kind of a commercial drives, but they look like streets and they feel like streets. And I think this is we are getting towards the end here, and I know we're coming up on the lunch hour, so I'm sure people don't necessarily want to go through that, although obviously we defer to the chair. But I do want to assure you that we're nearing the end. So in terms of civic space, this is an important element of mixed use, and we also know it's something that's important to Seminole County. But it needs to be addressed in a very specific way with infill and mixed use. So why do we want civic spaces? They're really important for quality of life, especially to the extent that you do have people living in somewhat higher density situations. Having that park space for them to enjoy is important. Very often these might be smaller spaces, but very intensely used, as in the image you see here. And we also want to make sure they're close to people. We want to make sure that these spaces are within a short walking distance of where people are spending their time or laying their heads. So our initial recommendations for civic spaces within the MUC are an aggregate of 10% of civic space. Now this is intense civic space, so this is not talking about stormwater or buffers or just simple green areas. We're talking about civic spaces that are designed to be heavily used. And they would be limited to specific types with specific standards, such as parks and greens, plazas and squares, greenways, and then you also want to encourage certain things that are kind of transitional green spaces like mid-block passages to encourage that walkability.
Mr. Chairman?
That allows people to walk between buildings.
So with that green space and park space, I'm not a landscape architect, nor do I want to pretend to be one, but I'd like to have someone with that expertise to give us some input.
Sure. And we absolutely have landscape architects on our team who can provide guidance in terms of appropriate design.
Or you could stay in a Holiday Inn Express.
Yeah, I could.
Now, we've talked a little bit about this already, but fundamentally, we want to make sure these places are designed with the mobility requirements to encourage that mixed-use, walkable, bikeable, drivable environment. That means things as simple as making sure that driveways connect between adjacent parcels, which is simple from a design standpoint, but sometimes complex from a regulatory standpoint or from a contractual standpoint. Sidewalks that are wide enough with shade and connectivity so that people can get where they're going in the hot Florida sun, which we know is certainly a factor here. And then making sure that, that we're accommodating the in-between, let's say the missing middle types of transportation, like we used to call it bicycling, but now we're dealing with, at a regional level, scooters, electric bicycles, and one-wheels, and all sorts of things that didn't exist probably 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago.
Mr. Chairman, on that same note, at a later date, can you also review the document that says dangerous by design to make sure that we're not inherently causing problems?
So, sorry, I heard dangerous by design. Can you?
There's a document, national
sir.
document out there that state of Florida is ranked #1. Orlando's ranked #3. We're in the Orlando district. I just want to make sure that we're not inherently designing something that would that would encourage us to be still up on the list of dangerous by design.
Absolutely. So the types of recommendations that we have for these mixed-use zones would absolutely address the dangerous by design report in terms of providing more accessibility, specifically for pedestrians, which is what that report addresses, but we also think it's important to address other modes such as bicycling as well. And then we've talked a little bit about parking already, providing, not just allowing for shared parking, but providing specific guidance for those calculations so people don't have to necessarily come up with a parking report every time they want to do some shared parking, although they certainly can if they think they want to be more aggressive about it. And then permitting, for instance, parallel parking on internal streets, both to provide convenient parking for people who want to access those buildings, as well as allowing those spaces to count towards the parking requirements. And then lastly, of course, bicycle parking to make sure we're accommodating those users as well. Last note I'm just going to touch on. These types of projects absolutely benefit from design guidelines, which is a little bit outside the scope of this particular effort, but that is something that we wanted to note, that design guidelines are an additional layer that can be added on top of these types of regulations to provide more guidance for the private sector. And with that, I'm handing it over to staff unless there's questions that you want to address now.
Ms. Hammack, if I can, please. Seems that the most recent example in the county, not in any city in Seminole County, but in the county, that these ideas can be incorporated would be along the Oxford Road area. Are we looking at these designs in incorporating that in the property that we're purchasing and the road, everything that's involved with the Oxford Road?
Yes, and for the record, Rebecca Hammack, Development Services Director. We actually already have guidelines adopted in the Land Development Code for Oxford Road, and that have similar criteria for the mixed use and trying to create a Main Street feel. So those have already been adopted in the Land Development Code. This idea is stemmed from the fact that we have the MXD future land use category within the comprehensive plan, but we do not have an implementing zoning district. So this would be the complementary zoning district to our MXD land use, and we could implement this type of zoning like along 1792, the Reagan Center area, the former Flea World would be a good candidate for this type of development.
I brought that up only because I think that, yes, we've done some design, especially on the road and the entrance to Oxford Road from the other side, and some changes in the transportation system and structure, but we really haven't designed the mixed use or the multifamily development yet, and we're not designing it. That is private.
Yes, it is private, but we do have regulations in place that private development will have to adhere to or be compliant with. We even have design standards for signage. We have a certain percentage of mix of use. So a lot of that is already built into the Land Development Code, and I can provide you the link to that.
And I don't want to beat this down, but County Manager, I just wanted to make sure that if we come up with better ideas before, the concrete hits the ground, that we would be able to try to incorporate some of those things into that new development, because that's the next one or the first one I see coming out of the ground.
Yeah, the Oxford Road already has quite a bit of overlay for that capability.
Correct.
It was considered for that entire project, which hopefully gets going in the near future. I'm not so sure, with downturn in the economy, when that's going to happen, but I think that was a good exercise. One of the first exercises that I experienced from a county staff perspective in giving consideration to the multimodal type transportation, as well as the walkability, pedestrian safety, and so forth. So I think that's a good start, perhaps for the MXD, if we're going to consider that.
Commissioner Delory.
Thank you for bringing it up, Mr. Chairman. I would like to know if the developer is still willing to move forward with that and what the timeline is, because if not, then we need to rethink Oxford Road.
Well, I think that's maybe
It's not here today, but I mean, at some point, that discussion should happen.
I mean, I can, but I haven't had any recent conversations, but what I can tell you is we still have the site plans have been submitted, and we have been requested to continue updating those to make them current in E-Plan. So I haven't heard anything that they wish to withdraw.
I mean, we
it's
do have a utility issue that we're dealing with, that sort of.
I mean, at some point,
Put
if
brakes
it's
on
not
that.
going to move forward, we just need to know that.
Yeah, and I think they're sort of waiting on us to address the water and sewer issues.
Correct.
Yeah. Before we move forward from this presentation and any more questions from the commission or answers from the staff, do we have anyone in the public or on the Zoom that would like to, first the public here that would like to talk about or has any questions or comments about this? Seeing none, anybody in the Zoom? Clint?
Yes, sir. I have several hands up.
I think you said no.
No, he said yes.
Oh, there is
Yes, sir.
somebody?
I have several hands up.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and
And Mr.
bring them
Chair-
forward?
Mr. Chairman, make sure, I know there's probably going to be some callers on the design standards for the rural. Just try to make sure that these callers are not for that, because we haven't discussed that yet.
Yeah, today, we're not discussing the rural boundary or the rural standards, design standards,
Well,
but,
It's the next item
It's the next
up.
item up.
yeah.
Right.
so, Clint, go ahead, want to bring out the first person?
It's Ms. Esposito.
Yes, sir. I got WAFA.
I can't.
Ms. Esposito.
Ms. Esposito.
Okay. Ms. Esposito?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Wafa Esposito, 5040 Hawks Hammock Way.
Yes, ma'am?
Do you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay. So I'm really hoping when this will come about, we would have more the possibility of publicizing where these projects will take place with ample time, because they are going to be an impact to the community. I would like to know what you think of that. I also, especially because this is not an urban area, and I don't know where this corridor really is going to be, where these landfill or infill properties are. However, from living in this area, I see that the traffic is a big issue, and I understand that those housing possibilities are not going to have necessarily the amount of cars typical per square mile. But whatever, we would like to hear about the traffic viability study, if there has been or if it's going to be done, to ensure that we really don't increase the traffic. There is also a question regarding, do we have a study or for our workforce in the area, are our senior citizens who would be interested in the affordable housing? Do we have people signing up to registry, and we take names for that so we know how much to convert instead of taking away land from commercial, which I really think we still need commercial for the area. The other thing is when it comes to public housing, or we call it affordable housing, unfortunately, most of the times the reserve study is not there and they fall into decay. We would like to hear what you think about that. And also proximity to the train and the bus. Does that mean we're going to increase busing in the area and cause more traffic jam? I mean, there is a lot of questions. I really hope this will go further for public input so we can feel comfortable about the change you're going to be making or whether adopting and where certain projects or not. Thank you. I hope that was clear, and I'm sorry if my accent is getting in your way.
Thank you, Ms. Esposito. No, I think we heard what you said, and we'll take that into consideration as we move forward. Others, Clint?
Chairman, I think give Ms. Holler on that.
Hello?
Ms. Holler,
Yes. Can I,
can the chair not see the callers?
I'm not seeing the callers right now. So, Ms. Holler,
am I being heard right now?
yes, you are. Yes, you
Oh,
are.
okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we should all be Zoom experts, right, by now. Cindy Holler, 1731 Beacon Drive, Sanford. The cottage court idea that Elijah brought up is really interesting, and I do have some retirement friends who live from church who live at Grand Oaks at Heathrow, and that kind of looks like, you know, the idea that she was presenting. So in the right area, I think that's very appropriate. Let's see, a couple other things. Our county, Florida's natural choice. So I think, you know, we kind of stick with that motto. So that's where I am, and a lot of other people I know. Just because you guys, or I should say the board brought it up and there was discussion on it, rooms were added onto houses in ancient Israel. So I guess, you know, they say history repeats itself. So anyway, that was just a side comment. I do not want to see our county build itself into having a water crisis. So I'm really concerned about that. You know, the more people, the more, what's the word? The more need for water, which is important to keep in mind. And no high density rural areas. I know that will be discussed in a future meeting, but I also want to talk about the parking issue. So they talk about shared parking. So if you have a lot of residents who are retired, they're home frequently, and then if you have businesses who are wanting to park there during the day, you really do have an issue with a lack of parking. So, and I see this on the Nextdoor app, that parking is a big issue. I see it on there a lot. So I don't have anything else, but thank you for allowing me to weigh in.
Thank you very much, Ms. Heller. I think one of the things I want to make sure that everybody does understand is that these are going to be in designated areas. This is not going to be countywide. I think everybody understands that, but I want to reiterate that to everyone that might be out there listening. I see that Joseph Humphreys has his hand raised. Can we get Mr. Humphreys in there?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Happy New Year to everybody. I hope everybody's well and healthy. Joseph Humphreys, 883 Cardinal Point Cove. First of all, I'd like to commend the staff and the consultants. I think they've done some pretty good work so far. That said, again, I think kind of tagging onto what Cindy said a little bit, understanding and knowing what you want the county to look like in the future. Obviously, the decisions that you make today will affect, you know, what the county looks like for many, many years to come. And one thing that, having been in business, we have to be careful of not trying to be everything to everybody. So I think it was Commissioner Herr had mentioned about trying to look outside of the community, outside of the area, outside of the state for successful examples where other communities have, you know, kind of tried to make these decisions. I think is a very good effort to pursue. I'm looking at a study right now that was done nationally, and basically the title being, you know, 7 issues of successful communities that I'll try to forward to everybody. But again, we hear constantly from people in the community, from all walks of life, from around the county, concerns about the direction that the county's headed, whether it's traffic, whether it's school crowding, or so on. So needless to say, the decisions that you make now will affect that going forward. So I think it's important to decide, what do we want our community to look like 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now? We all know that the state is growing at almost exponential proportions. So we have to be careful. And as somebody who's been in farming and hunting, we all know that an acre of ground can only handle so many critters. So, and we're a small county, so we just want to make sure that we don't lose, that which attracted most of us, and actually generations of people to Florida's natural choice. So again, thank you for your efforts. Congratulations again, I think, for some good work from the consultants, and hopefully we'll come up with something we can all be proud of for generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Anyone else? Clint, I don't see anybody on my screen.
Mr. Chairman?
No, sir.
Following up on Mr. Humphrey's comments, I think it would be wise, we're having this discussion, and as well as the public, and we continue to hear this, if staff could bring up the studies that were done back in, I think, the late 80s, early 90s, make those available. I don't think everybody has seen them on this commission, nor has the public seen that. We've had a lot of questions where the county's going to be, where we suspect it's going to be, what's going to plan for the future. A lot of those studies have already been done, and I think people are going to be shocked to understand that I think it was figured that Seminole County's ultimate population would be somewhere close to 760,000 residents by the year 2040. Now, whether that ultimately is the case or not, yet to be seen. But I don't know that everybody's aware of those studies that were done and what that means or doesn't mean, and how and what actions we take may or may not affect that. I would like to see staff make that available to the commission as well as the public in general.
Commissioner Lockhart has her hand up. Bigger does not always make better, right, Commissioner?
Correct. That's right.
Yeah, thank you. I think even more recently than that, having gone through the visioning process regionally, the How Shall We Grow effort identified these corridors that we're talking about that were always intended to be higher density urban corridors, and the preservation of rural areas and suburban areas. And I agree. I feel like I'm beating a little bit of a drum here. We need to make a conscious effort to proactively communicate those visioning processes to our community so that they know what was already envisioned. And if it's time, which I think it is, to start a new visioning process, we need to start formulating what that looks like and starting to talk about how the community wants to engage in that. Clearly, what we thought was going to happen and what was envisioned, that we're at the end of that timeline, right? That was a 2020, right? Well, here we are, it's 2021. So what's that next visioning process? And what I'm hearing from the community is they want to be involved in that vision and that creation of that. So we really need to proactively talk about that process and what the timeline is for that. I don't think they can speak any more clearly to us, and I feel like we've talked about it and around it, but we kind of need to put pen to paper and put some deadlines and timelines in place, I
Thank you, Commissioner. And I think that between what you and what Commissioner Zimbauer said is that, yes, we do need to go through an ongoing. I don't think this is just something that we do stop and then, wait until the next, 2040 or something, but an ongoing visioning process as we continue forward. So let's, I think that right now, this is the beginning stages of looking at that. I do believe that. Is there anyone else, Clint, right now on this subject?
No, sir.
Thank you. Commissioners, do we have anything else on number one of part four-part work session today. Okay. We are now scheduled to go into the Planning Division to talk about public notification. I know this is something that we all are very interested and concerned about. I don't know if the president, regardless of how long we take, how long is the presentation potentially, Mary Markowitz, before we make a decision as to whether to move on or break it at this point?
I mean, I would say it's about a 10-minute presentation. I can go as fast or as slow as the board would
Well, we don't
like.
want you to go fast simply to accommodate time. You know, this is important. So 10 minutes. I think we all talked about this before. What is the pleasure of the commission? Do we want to break now and come back? And if Mary, it would be all right that you could do this after lunch?
I'm available if you'd like to delay it as well.
Mr. Chairman.
And Chairman,
Yes, Commissioner.
I think we still have a portion of part four. We
Right.
skipped a part of part four. Which
I'm
was-
sorry.
which,
Did we?
It's not, part four had our presentation from Canaan, but there's also a portion from staff to talk about the rural design standards.
Okay.
Which is the marker that keeps coming up on the screen. We could do that. I think it's just a staff presentation, not
Okay.
that a staff presentation is just a staff presentation, but we don't have a consultant that's here on the clock. So if that's something that you wanted to talk about
Why don't
this
we do
afternoon,
that,
do
and
that
then we'll
too.
take the break after that? How does that sound to everybody? All right, so let's go ahead. I'm sorry, I did not see this on my, on the calendar or on the agenda, but that's okay. I see it, and my fault. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jeff Hopper with the Planning and Development Division. What I have is just a brief update on the subject of rural non-residential design standards, which is something that's been talked about for some time. But what we're really kind of looking for is to back up a little bit. We're talking about the idea of building appearance criteria for structures that are not houses, not agricultural structures like barns in the East Rural area, to kind of preserve that rustic country feel. As you all directed us, staff held a community meeting to invite public input. That happened on December 21st. We notified commercial property owners in Geneva by mail. Email notifications were sent to other interested citizens. This meeting information was also posted on Nextdoor and the planning webpage. At that meeting, total attendance was 2 for the in-person meeting and none joined by Zoom. The meeting video, however, has been posted on the planning webpage. Staff will actually have sent out another mailing to the same commercial property owners, inviting them to view the meeting video on the webpage and provide further input. So what we have now, I have the presentation that was made at the community meeting, which is part of your packets. I can go through that, but what we really need at this point is to request further direction from the board. Should we continue to reach out to these property owners, get their comments? Should we go ahead and propose some particular standards for people to review?
Mr. Chairman, if I may weigh in on this because it's my district. I have talked to the community, and the Geneva Citizens Association is in favor of this. Many of the residents are in favor of this. I've also spoken to 2 of the commercial property owners who have no issues with the design standards that are currently in place in Chuliota. That said, I do have a concern that we have not had further input from those other commercial property owners, and it's a handful. It's not a lot. So I would very much, as a district commissioner, suggest that we attempt to reach those commercial property owners again before moving forward to adopt this at a proper hearing.
So if I can understand this direction that you would like to give the staff, and you would like to concur as a consensus, would be that we continue to reach out to commercial and residential.
Absolutely.
Owners in seeking their input.
That's correct.
So just continue what we're doing until we hit a critical mass.
Within a reasonable time, I suspect, and what I heard from some of the public was the December 21st, two things: COVID, number two, the holidays. I know it's always a struggle, and I know COVID is often used as an excuse. That said, people are allowed or entitled to attend by Zoom, but I think we need to give benefit of the doubt to those commercial property owners and the rest of the citizens that may want to weigh in to be able to have that capability to do that. So
Mr. Chairman?
I would favor an additional meeting, community meeting as well.
Okay, Commissioner.
I would agree with Commissioner Zimbauer, but I want to make sure that when we coordinate that additional community meeting, it's not around the holiday.
Right.
It's not, I just want to make sure that
We're on board with that.
And I want to make sure that we're putting out enough public notice, however we do that, to make sure that everyone, and I mean everyone, is aware of it.
Right. So.
All right, is
How
that
many
consensus?
I'm sorry. How many individual commercial property owners are we talking about?
I think there's a total of 6 total owners that own commercial parcels, and I think Rebecca.
Based on the parcel records from the property appraiser's map, there were, I believe, 16 property owners.
All right.
More parcels than that because some had multiple parcels, but.
Correct, and multiple owners. And we have, I think, what was the total that we had, Rebecca? Wasn't it a total of 33 acres or something like that, of which that 33 acres, a significant amount of it's not developable because of where it's located, and et cetera, et cetera. And I may not have that exactly right, but.
Yes, that's correct. There were 6 areas, I think that's where you were coming
Okay.
up with the 6,
Yeah.
which those 6 areas are made up of, some of them are made up of several parcels.
Right.
But I think you're correct. There's approximately around 30-some acres that could be developed as non-residential. And of course, we don't have any development interest in that now. And of course, when we advertised for the community meeting, we sent out notices basically saying that we were trying to gauge interest in those non-residential design standards.
Right.
And the people that did participate in the community meeting were interested in implementing design standards. So they're not, the 2 people that attended were not actual property owners, but we have, as Jeff said.
Not commercial property.
Not commercial property owners,
Right,
yes, sorry.
right.
But as Jeff stated, we have sent out another notice to those property owners, trying to get them engaged in the process.
Yes,
And we'll continue to do that.
in abundance of caution, I would.
Let's try to go a little bit through the chair, because there's multiple people who want to talk. Commissioner Lockhart?
I'm sorry, just as a follow-up, since we're talking about 16 individuals, instead of sending a notice, could we send an invitation? I think the way maybe we're communicating this is that we're notifying people, and I think if we're engaging in such a small, I know there's a greater community and I know it impacts a greater number of people, but if these 16 individual property owners whose properties it is that we're talking about impacting, perhaps we should invite them to something that is specific to them as property owners rather than just scattering our seed around. I just feel like this needs to be maybe a more intimate, not saying that the public is not invited, a public meeting before Brian Applegate has a stroke on me. but something that these folks realize we want to hear from them and we are inviting them to a discussion. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, Commissioner Hurd? Thank you.
Similar to that, my comment is that to continue to do the same thing over and over again is the definition of insanity. So we had 0 out of 16 come. We had 2 residents. We're talking about commercial. So we really need to figure out a different way to reach out to them, whether it's an invitation, it's 16 phone calls, it's whatever it is. But we're talking about a significant impact to private property owners, and we got it. They have to be in this conversation.
Mr. Chairman,
So,
Commissioner Glover?
just go knock on their door.
Well, so
There's no door.
who's going to fly to Chicago?
Yeah, there's no door.
Okay, well,
But, you know, I mean, we
Call
could
'em
text,
up.
we could email, but people can always say they never got it. A phone call and making a message, you know, is, you know, people are going to do it. Yes, Ms. Hammond.
Thank you. So we did send out specific letters to those property owners, trying to invite them. But we don't have, some of the address or post office boxes, and we don't have phone numbers or email addresses for these
Got it.
property owners. I mean, we could send those and maybe to the district commissioner, maybe you have contacts for those.
I've got contacts with some of those, and what I would do is, you know, if you want to put it in an invitation format, if you want to put it in a notice format, it doesn't really matter to me as a district commissioner. If you want to send it register return receipt to the address of record of the property appraisers, because I assure you they're getting notice of their taxes. If you want to do that to ensure that they've received it, so we have proof that they did or it was delivered to someone. You know, I will tell you that as a general rule, the people in that part of my district, including the property owners of commercial property, are not shy. And they're not necessarily not engaged of what's going on. But that said, there are some absentee owners that don't live in the area that may or may not have a concern. So they at least, and that's why I advocate that we should do it. I'm not advocating we should do the same thing of the interpretation of insanity, but I certainly think that not doing it during the holidays has a benefit and advantage in the world of COVID.
Okay. Is that direction enough for you? Yes. Okay.
And if staff wants to work with the county manager's office and my office on how the letter is articulated, happy to share it with the rest of the commission if they want to weigh on how the letter's drafted, whether it's, you know, an invitation or how it's, the verbiage is, or a notice, or in the county attorney's office. I'm fine with all that, too.
Commissioner Lockhart? Did you have a
Well,
hand raised?
I don't want to get hung up on whether it says invitation at the top or notification at the top. My point was the way in which we are engaging, that we need to let them know, whether it's by phone call or skywriting or whatever it is, that we are wanting them to participate. This isn't a box that we're checking. That's all.
Clearly, you know, through the office of the county manager in the department, we will get the notifications as indicated, that we've got to get to these people so that they have been, so we know they've been notified. We know that they have the opportunity.
Or every reasonable
Yeah.
attempt has been made.
Well, that they have been notified.
Right,
They
right.
have it, and they had the
right.
opportunity to engage. Whether they do or not is their choice.
Right.
You know, not us, as you say, checking the box, Commissioner Lockhart. Okay. Is there any public comment on this segment of the work session? I don't see any. Clint, do you have any?
No, sir.
Thank you very much. All right, it is now 15 after 12. If we don't see anything else before us, we will go and start right up into the next three items on the agenda, starting at 1:30. County Manager, the next 3 and 4 on our agenda are outside source. Should we start there, or do we want to start right off where we belong, or do we want to go right into the consultants that are going to do 3 and 4? County Manager?
Depending on how much discussion you want to have on notification, my expectation is we're going to have some members of the public who are interested in talking about notifications. So,
Yes.
I don't know who might want to talk about the other 2 items. So my suggestion would be, because we are expecting some public input, that you start with notification.
Okay. And I think that that's something that we all feel very strongly about. So we'll start with notification right off at 1:30. And yes, Commissioner Hurd?
I just wanted to bring us back to the first session from this morning, and I just got some just-in feedback. Got the Moderna vaccine, process was perfection.
Thank you. Thank
So
you so
I
much.
thought I'd share that. We don't have the word perfection used very often, so that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that is pretty awesome. That's a great get. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, with that, we will recess for 1:30.
Thank you.